This is a Glassbox Media podcast.
What does a podcast production company do? Where is the industry headed? These are just a few of the questions that podcast founders and experts are answering in a new show from the Podcast Academy and DCP Entertainment, Podcast 360. Company founders and podcast experts will answer 3 questions about all things podcasting. They'll have just 60 seconds to answer. Join us on Podcast 360 with new episodes every Tuesday. Follow us at DCP Official for show news and updates.
Welcome to another exciting episode of The Business of Sound. My name is David Segura, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Glassbox Media, and as always, the host for this podcast. Well, our goal is ultimately to provide you with actionable insights and information related to the world of podcasting that we hope will make you either a better podcaster host or executive in the industry. Join us every other Thursday as we bring insights and conduct exclusive interviews with some of the industry's leading voices. But before we get started, I'm going to ask you to smash the like button and also subscribe to give us a 5-star rating so that you can stay up to date with all the news in the podcast industry. Today, we actually have a very special episode, and John Beal was kind enough to join us. So for background, he's an executive at Mopac, an amazing production company that is not only involved with podcasting, but also TV as well. Additionally, one of the main things we're going to be here to talk today about is his role as executive producer of LISK, which is Long Island Serial Killer, an amazing podcast that Glassbox is also very thankful to play a small part in as well. So we hope you enjoy today's episode. And ultimately, we want to bring you all the information we can about the show, and we want to dive into the inspiration behind LISK, what lessons, for example, John has taken away from it, and everything else. So with that in mind, let's get started with the interview, and let's kick it over to John. So John, first of all, thank you a lot for being here.
Of course. Yeah, my pleasure.
And I guess with that in mind, I'm sure a lot of folks in the audience, before we start diving into LISK and Mopac in general, they're going to want to know a little bit more about your background. I already know a lot of the tidbits, but I think it'll be fresh for the audience. So I wanted to turn it over to you to kind of run us through kind of what you've done before and what led you to your current role.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, thanks again for having me. I was in television production for a long time. I kind of came up in news at ABC News for a long time. And then I was in sort of in the news divisions at MTV and VH1 News. And then I was at the E! Network in LA, all in production roles, running shows for them. And the further along I got, the more it became sort of a development role as well. And actually, my wife and I were moving back from the West Coast back to New York, which we were excited about. But I was looking for a role, and I got reached out. A recruiter reached out to me for a role at Audible, and it was essentially to develop their sort of short form original programming. They were launching back then. It was called Audible Channels, I think, and then it morphed into a couple other things, and now it's Audible Originals. So I had a chance to work with a lot of great people there from the industry, and really sort of set the hook working in the audio space. And then I was had a role at YouTube from there, and really enjoyed working with creators, working in the digital space there. Had a small role in getting them at least open to the idea of working in the podcasting space. We had a space in LA called the YouTube space, appropriately enough. And so we had set aside some space there where video content creators started to record their podcasts there, which was really exciting. And along the way, I'd sort of worked with different on-air personalities who also had podcast presences. Henry Zabrowski, we worked together on a TV show when he was launching Last Podcast on the Left. You know, he was in episode 13 or something, and he was like, "Oh, I got this thing." I thought, "Oh, it sounds great." And he and his buddies were really funny, and you know, it's turned into this juggernaut. So they've always been good friends to us as well. But yeah, and then my wife and I were making a move to Austin in late 2018, 2019, early 2019. And a colleague of mine was here in Austin, and he worked for a production company here that was very much interested in kind of leaning into the podcast space, knowing that it was a big interest of the owner of the company, as well as knowing that more and more the kind of podcast to TV model is becoming more of a thing. Yeah. So I was able to kind of lay out a game plan for him in terms of what it might look like, both to create original shows that we recorded on our own, as well as, working with assets that we already had in house, which in fact we can get into more, but that was sort of the genesis of LISK becoming a podcast.
It's really cool. So tell me a little bit more about the company. Like, we've always said the word Mopac as like a shorthand for it, but how do you guys think of yourselves, and what's the overall kind of branding for the company as a whole?
Well, we always say that we're like we say victim or survivor based narrative story, wherein we're not interested in telling stories, true crime stories that are kind of blood and guts, if you will, as much as like trying to understand the people who are on the other side of that equation, which are the family, the friends, the people who, had to endure so much throughout, whether it's, when LISK, it was over a decade, or another podcast we're working on occurred over the span of 20, 30 years, and so we always like to consider ourselves compassionate storytellers, and thorough, we like to tie it all together with hopefully the least amount of our voices, meaning a lot of those times it's our narrator, Chris or Shannon, hopefully not injecting themselves as much as letting people tell the story themselves.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess let's dive into it, because just for the audience's benefit out there, you guys are obviously being modest, but right now, one of the biggest smash hit true crime podcasts that exists out there is LISK, Long Island Serial Killer. And of course, with the recent capture of the alleged, want to emphasize the word alleged killer.
Very good. Yeah. Good.
The show's really been blowing up, and it's generating over 2 million, monthly downloads, is in the top 10 charts in both Apple and Spotify, and has really been something, frankly, that a lot of people, from journalists to the general public, they're relying on the podcast to get their information. So what was the genesis of this podcast, and what was the original vision for why you all embarked on this journey for Long Island Serial Killer?
It's a good question. We had, on the TV side of the company, captured a large number of assets in the form of interviews, probably close to 4 years ago now, where we had, boots on the ground in Long Island, filming interviews with, like I said, friends and family, police, political people, stuff like that. And the idea was that it was going to be turned into a series, and due to a series of unfortunate circumstances outside of our control, it didn't get made into a television series for like an ID or an A&E. And so we loved what we had, but the problem or the feedback we got rather, was that since we didn't have a bow to tie it all together at the end with being able to point the finger at someone, we had run into kind of a roadblock there on the TV side. And we thought there really is no better, forum for being able to tell a story and pose a lot of difficult questions than podcasting. So starting in kind of it was late 2019, we started to kind of go through all this material, and were able to put together what ended up being season 1 of LISK. And ultimately, in the end, I think it was really effective because we were able to highlight the people, the victims, who were the Go For and others, without necessarily needing to say, here's the guy, if only because we weren't Suffolk County or the FBI, and they supposedly had no idea who it was either. Although come to learn with the arrest of Rex Heuermann that maybe they had a little better idea than we thought all along. So
that's interesting. And I know this has been a long time coming. In other words, you guys have put in a lot of work into it before this arrest. What was that like? Kind of like knowing that you're doing a great podcast, but also knowing that the case is unsolved. What was it like for the company, the creators, and even, to the extent you can talk about that, your relationship with law enforcement?
Yeah, I mean, it was frustrating, to say the least. I think it was exciting to have a podcast come out that people responded to. I guess a little other color is that we released it on like March 15th of 2020. So right as COVID, as we knew it was setting in, everybody stayed home and we thought, oh, this might be great. It turns out that through those first 4 or 5 months, everybody just wanted to know what the heck was happening with the world. And so our podcast sort of came out, to a very modest reception. And then as people were home kind of figuring out their daily lives, it really took off for us over the course of that first year. And, I think both the upside and the downside is that we were able to make this podcast season 1 and tell these stories without having a conclusion. So we were excited that we were able to get that out there, but we also faced the dilemma of everybody saying like, what's next? What's going on? And so really in reality, we faced a lot of questions from listeners saying, what else can you tell us? And to be perfectly frank, like there wasn't a ton other than, we had some connections to law enforcement in the community, but they were very tight-lipped. There was clearly what we think was a very purposeful series of roadblocks set up by police, not just for us, but for the FBI. Through what we came to learn was, essentially like that blue curtain in Suffolk County didn't want people peering behind it.
Let me ask you this. And again, I'm sure there's reasons for it, certainly way above my pay grade or level of expertise. But obviously in being involved with this podcast, like I've learned a lot. It's probably mind blowing, but why do you think there wasn't a lot of cooperation if you had to speculate between, let's say, like local police and the FBI? Usually it's, they work pretty closely. Yeah. So everyone's trying to figure out, I guess, like maybe why this is a little different.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, that should be a pretty open line of communication if you're really dedicated to getting this thing solved. We always were under the impression that Suffolk County leadership, Suffolk County Police Department leadership at the very highest levels had some sort of, I was going to say bone to pick. They had an interest in not having the FBI step in, and it comes to be that it has become very clear that the former police chief, James Burke, didn't want the FBI sniffing around. He didn't want people trying to solve the case. It's my belief, it's our belief that it was not because they were necessarily complicit in the crimes, other than they didn't want people sniffing into their business because maybe they had other activities that they didn't want to come to light. So I think that was sort of the motivating factor, but it's staggering to think the amount of really like pettiness and ego, that really ultimately blocked this investigation, because as we came to learn, a number of the facets of the case that ultimately solved it had been in pocket at Suffolk County for a while in terms of a lead on a truck that was seen, cell phone records, a lot of this stuff. So it's kind of mind blowing to think that it in the end boiled down to a small handful of people blocking it out of their own self-interest.
Wow. Especially when people's lives are at stake. That's kind of crazy and unfortunate.
Yeah, but, it's really crazy.
These things do happen. And like gives credence, I guess, some of the conspiracy theories that were out there. So that's interesting. One thing I will ask too, one thing that makes your company pretty unique is that there is a very rich TV heritage That is what the company has done as a foundation of it. But obviously now you're building out the podcast division. Do you think at this point now this is something that you want to revisit? So whereas before there wasn't a bow on it, whereas before a lot of, let's say, buyers out there weren't so sure about a case that was unsolved, still an alleged, case right now, but nonetheless, people feel pretty confident that there's more certainty around what happened. Is this something that your company will be exploring now for TV adaptation?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when the arrest was announced in mid-July, we knew we were sitting on, a series of assets that very few people had. And knowing that we had probably arguably the best chunk of assets you could want that went from sort of the inception of the case, meaning these women disappearing, up until virtually the time of the arrest, that made it very appealing to a lot of networks. And so I can't get into it too much right now, but we are very close to finally putting that TV deal together, which is super exciting as a whole for a company, as well as exciting to know that these people whose voices you've heard over a podcast, some form or another, will hopefully have life on your screen at home. So it's very cool.
It's amazing. And so in a funny way too, it also comes together full circle essentially.
Yeah, totally. And it's unique because as the pipeline from podcast to TV show started kind of blowing up with some of the Dirty Johns and, Dr. Death and ones like those, it was it felt very much like you made a podcast to become a TV show versus we made a TV show to become a podcast, to become a TV show. So we added a level of engineering that we did not intend to, but it appears that it will hopefully work out for us.
I hear that. All right. So I want to ask you something that I feel at peace with, but I will go out in there and say it. True crime is a very special animal. There's incredibly important ethical and even legal considerations to always manage as you're producing this type of content. But I will say more than one person in the media industry has told me before they feel a little bit conflicted when it comes to the commercialization of it. So in our case, we are pairing certain advertisers against this content alongside you, like Rocket Money and others. They know what they're getting into and they're enthusiastic about it. Not necessarily about the tragedies, of course, but to clarify, what they're very clear about is that they want to be against something that's trending and that has demographics which they value. In this case, the female demographic, which largely are the ones that are consuming true crime content. How do you, both as an executive in your company, kind of manage that conflict, if you will, between we're telling a great story and we need to commercialize this versus we have some unique responsibilities to either the victims or just taste, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, that's a great point. We talk about that internally here, where we know that this is not it's not a hobby for us, right? We invested resources in making this podcast, and while it would be great to be able to bring content like this out and just say, enjoy it, we try to wrap our heads around finding a balance within ourselves, knowing that if we can get this podcast out there and we can present sponsors, show sponsors, the Rocket Monies, the Better Helps to the world, and do it in a way that feels palatable to the listener, we know that in the end, it will help fuel the pipeline that will allow us to keep pursuing other important stories. So for us, it might be a little bit of the legitimizing thing, but we also feel strongly that without trying to integrate, sponsors who are, great enough to be part of this podcast, we think that it will only beget better things in the future.
Yeah, I think you're right. At the end of the day, too, there is a public, demand for this content. In other words, there's a need to know. even people that don't feel they're in immediate danger, like they want to be informed, and it's going to be done well or it's not. So my personal opinion is that if great, storytellers and journalists like you are handling it, there'll be great content, but it'll also be like managed the right way. So I'm a little bit biased, but definitely appreciate the work that you've done on Long Island serial killer. I think you guys just really nailed it and just really kind of just perfect storm.
Thank you. Yeah. And I hope that maybe this is me asking for a little psychic space from listeners, but it's like, I think that people understand more and more, in the rough and tumble early days of podcasting, you could hear a show and not hear any advertisements. But I think the appetite for it is, as the industry grows, that people know that these are not just mom and pop shops. You've got multi-million dollar companies putting content out there. And so I think the palatability for that stuff is sort of budgeting in people's minds to hear those things. So at least I hope so.
I think so. Even like people that, let's say, like podcasts but aren't immersed in it day to day like we are, they recognize that as production value increases, there's a cost to that. And so if it's not going to be covered through subscriptions, it's got to be covered through commercial advertisers, which we're obviously all very grateful for.
Yeah.
Just want to shout out to them for a second.
For sure.
I guess one other question I had in mind too, and I'm sure the audience is wondering too, after this, massive hit, I know that you're exploring a number of other projects. So I just wanted to kick it back over to you. To the extent you're comfortable sharing, are there any projects that are going to be released relatively soon that your company's excited about?
Yeah, we are. We're kind of all hands on deck for LISK right now, making sure that we're finding meaningful content to put out to our listeners that hopefully furthers the discussion in a way that is impactful. And we're also working on our other next project that's coming out is a case, and I don't want to not say too little, but not say too much, in that it's a story about a camp that has very strong religious ties, that had a scandal happen over a decade ago that was terrible, and sort of surfaced the fact that it was all a surprise to them. But it turns out there's a lot more at play kind of behind the scenes in terms of what people knew and what people were honest about. So we've been on the road throughout. Prior to the arrest of Rex Heuermann, we were out on the road for some 8 or 10 months doing interviews, which we're really proud of. That a lot of our interviews we do try to do in person, as opposed to, if it's a heavy topic, you don't want to sit down with someone for 5 hours over a Zoom call, knowing that there's an element that kind of robs some of it of its vitality. So we'll have that project coming out hopefully in the next couple months, 2-3 months, if at all possible.
It's exciting. Well, I certainly can't wait. And I mean that not just as a potential partner, but on top of that as well, a listener. You guys do great content. And so literally hats off to you.
Thank you. Yeah. And just so I say it, we couldn't keep things rolling without the help of Glassbox. And it's just a bonus to have you guys be a sort of willing and compassionate and eager and very cool partner to have on all this stuff. So it's makes it a lot more fun, because dealing with advertising is not always my personal ball of wax, but you guys have made it a really seamless experience. So we're super appreciative.
Well, we definitely appreciate that. And, we hope to continue the relationship. And again, we really are fanboys and fangirls here. I remember, for example, when we first started working together, my co-founder, Chris Whitman, his wife was super enthusiastic. She had already been a longtime fan. So it is coming from a very sincere place. So that's great.
Once I heard that, I knew that it was going to be a match made in heaven. So.
Well, it's good to hear. Yeah. I'm glad she said that then. Yeah. Very cool. Well, John, I appreciate your time. I'm going to play us out in a second, but just wanted to, again, thank you for, taking time off your busy schedule to come on the show today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. we are super excited about this new development, both for the podcast and for the families of the victims. And we're just excited to continue rolling things forward and are appreciative of your guys' help in helping make all that happen.
All right. Thank you so much, John.
Thanks.
And as always, thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Business of Sound. The show is produced by Erica Miranda and Nick Kastner. As always, new episodes are released every other Thursday, and we ask kindly that you consider leaving us a 5-star review because it makes the show more discoverable and that much more fun to do, frankly. And apart from that, feel free to follow us on your social media platform of choice, whether that's Instagram, LinkedIn, or elsewhere. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you next time.